Welcome to this rapid revision video looking at the Prague Spring. Firstly, a bit of background. Communist Czechoslovakia. Since the 1948 coup orchestrated by Stalin, part of his Soviet satellite states which I've done a separate video on, Czechoslovakia had been effectively ruled by Moscow. This meant that its economy more benefited the USSR than it did its own people. As a result, Czech citizens were short of consumer goods and had very hard lives indeed. They couldn't speak out as the media was censored and political opponents were often persecuted. Purges of the government had targeted anyone who had links to the West in World War II, which was a lot of people, Jewish people, Catholics, army officers and democratic politicians. Some of these were imprisoned without trial, others simply disappeared altogether. Student protests in 1966 showed how unhappy people were with the communist regime. So was it time for change? Enter the scene Alexander Dubcek. Dubcek was elected first secretary of the Czech Communist Party in 1968. The USSR trusted him and was happy for him to try and make the government more popular in Czechoslovakia, hoping that this would bring a bit of stability. Dubcek was loyal to the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, but he had some fairly radical ideas about the changes he wanted to make to government. His slogan was socialism with a human face, where socialism in this context can mean communism. This was a philosophy that believed in communism, but it also believed that communism didn't have to make people miserable. He believed people could criticise the government and still be loyal to communist ideals. This was very welcome to those Czechs who had been protesting, but Moscow was far less enthusiastic. The Prague Spring. Dubček's reforms became known as the Prague Spring, after the capital city of Czechoslovakia. Censorship had been relaxed. Criticism of the government was to be allowed. Another reform he introduced was reform to trade unions. These were made more powerful. Direct government control of industry was also to be relaxed. Also, Dubcek wanted to give more power to regional government to represent local issues. This meant that there was less centralised power in the Czech system. He also wanted to introduce more trade to the West, to bring in new and more money and also bring in new products for people to buy. Foreign travel was meant to be allowed as well. This increasingly opened up travel to Czech people. And multi-party elections were even mooted, at least one day, although Dubcek was realistic and stressed that this was a plan for many years later. He still believed that communism would win such elections. The Czech people loved the sound of these reforms, as you can see from these signs being held aloft, proudly stating Viva Dubcek. However, the Soviet reaction was anything but enthusiastic. By 1968, the Soviet premier was Leonid Brezhnev. Excuse me, I just need to compose myself for a second. Brezhnev's eyebrows always catch me out whenever I see a photograph of him, so okay, I think I'm over it. So by 1968, the Soviet premier was Leonid Brezhnev. He was concerned by challenges to the USSR's control across the satellite states. For example, Ceausescu's Romania was refusing to attend Warsaw Pact meetings. Ceausescu is pretty much a monster himself. Tito in Yugoslavia, another controversial figure, refused to accept USSR control. That was also a challenge. Brezhnev worried that other Warsaw Pact countries would follow Dubček's example in Czechoslovakia. He pressured Dubček not to go too far with his reforms, and he organised military exercises in Czechoslovakia as a threat, just to remind Dubček that he could invade if he wanted to. Dubček invited Ceausescu and Tito to a meeting. This pushed Brezhnev to act. He did indeed launch an invasion of Czechoslovakia, and that's what we'll have a look at now. 500,000 Warsaw Pact troops invaded Czechoslovakia on the 20th of August 1968. As you can see on the map, they came from East Germany, Poland, the Soviet Union itself, and indeed Hungary. Brezhnev had ordered Czech troops not to resist, and they did not. There was very little that ordinary Czech people could do against Warsaw Pact tanks, though roadblocks and isolated incidents of bravery and resistance against the armour did occur. Invading forces had not expected any resistance at all. They'd expected to be welcomed as liberators, being seen as people keeping the peace. So the very frosty reception that they got from the Czech people came as a nasty surprise to ordinary Warsaw Pact conscripts. Reactions to the invasion led to what is now referred to as Brezhnev Doctrine. Images of Czech citizens standing up to Soviet tanks fed into Western arguments that people were unhappy under communism and prevented from being free. Brezhnev looked like the aggressor, despite his argument that it was necessary for the unity and the security of the communist bloc. His reaction has been described as Brezhnev Doctrine. He argued that the actions of just one communist country actually affected all communist countries all over the world. Therefore, the other countries had a duty to intervene and stop unwanted actions by single communist countries, as had happened in Dubcek's Czechoslovakia. In short, it meant that communist countries would gang up on any country that tried to introduce liberal reforms like the Prague Spring. So what was the impact of the Prague Spring? You'll notice I've used a slightly less terrifying picture of Brezhnev for this bit. Well, in Czechoslovakia, it's pretty straightforward. The Prague Spring ended with the Soviet invasion. This means that those liberal reforms simply never happened. But the picture in the rest of Europe is rather different and more complex. Perhaps predictably, Yugoslavia and Romania condemned the invasion. However, the Italian and French communist parties, they took similar action and they ended their ties to Moscow. East Germany and Poland, though, well, they welcomed the invasion. They felt that the risk of reforms in their own countries had lessened. Moscow's control over Warsaw Pact countries increased. This is emphasised by Brezhnev Doctrine, where everyone else was expected to gang up on the odd one out. Between the USSR and the USA, though, the West was outraged by the invasion and made strong protests to the Soviet Union. A United Nations resolution condemning the invasion was put forward, but, predictably, this was vetoed by the USSR. Everyone expected that to happen, by the way. Despite the amount of outrage, no strong action was taken. Brezhnev felt that this justified his actions. And what about on the USA's reputation? The USA's attention at this time, in 1968, was on the Vietnam War. It was beginning to try and de-escalate tensions with the USSR, a process known as détente, which we'll look at a different time. Countries saw that the USA was quick to criticise the USSR, but very slow to take any direct action. Our final summary then, and it's quite a detailed one. In 1968, Alexander Dubcek was elected leader of the Czechoslovakian Communist Party. He wanted to introduce liberal reforms, what he called socialism with a human face. His reforms were known as the Prague Spring, and they included relaxation of censorship, trade restrictions with the West and foreign travel, increased power for regional government and trade unions, the long-term goal of multi-party elections. Brezhnev saw this, alongside challenges from Romania and Yugoslavia, as too much of a risk to Moscow's control. On the 20th of August 1968, 500,000 Warsaw Pact troops invaded. The Prague Spring ended. Brezhnev argued that the actions of one country to become more liberal was a threat to all communist countries, and so all those other communist countries had a duty to intervene. This became known as Brezhnev Doctrine. So that's the end of this video on the Prague Spring and Brezhnev Doctrine. I hope it's been useful to you, and if it has, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps promote my content. And if there's anything that you're desperate for me to cover in the future, pop it in the comments below. I'll do what I can. Other than that, thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.